Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak today. I'll admit, it's always a little scary to get up here and speak in front of people, but that terror actually is a growth opportunity for me. It causes me maybe to study a little more and look a little bit more closely at what I'm thinking about speaking about. And this morning, what I'd like to do is kind of zoom in on a small part of the crucifixion story. It's the part of the story where Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus prepare and bury Jesus' body. I got the clickers. And what I'm going to do first is read that account, and I would encourage you to turn to John chapter 19. If you're using a Pew Bible, that's on page 852. You may want to have that in front of you for reference. But starting in verse 38, it says that later, Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body of Jesus. Now, Joseph was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly, because he feared the Jewish leaders. With Pilate's permission, he came and took the body away. He was accompanied by Nicodemus, the man who earlier had visited Jesus at night. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. Taking Jesus' body, the two of them wrapped it with the spices in strips of linen. This was in accordance with the Jewish burial customs. At the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden, a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid. Because it was the Jewish day of preparation, and since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. And this story, it appears in all four Gospels. And I always kind of feel like if something appears in all four Gospels, it must be pretty important. It's something that God really wanted us to know about. And when I think about it, Joseph and Nicodemus experienced this, and really, in a way, experienced the death of Jesus like nobody else in human history. Now, Joseph of Arimathea, he was described in the Bible, and we don't have the time to read all these references, but he was described in the Bible as a rich man, a respected member of the council, which that's a reference to the Sanhedrin, and a good and upright man. And as we just read in John, it says that he was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly. And Nicodemus was a Pharisee. He was a member of the Jewish council as well, of the Sanhedrin. And just to refresh your memory, the Sanhedrin is sort of like they're the Supreme Court of Jewish society, and they also, as we've been studying when we went through the Ten Commandments in Exodus, there's a real close connection between religion and the rule of law in Israel. And so my understanding is that there were about 71 men on that, and a lot of them were religious leaders, and some of them, I'm sure, were experts at the law. Nicodemus also visited Jesus at night, and Dan last week talked a little bit about part of that visit, where he came to talk to Jesus, learn about Jesus in that conversation. And he said himself during that little encounter with Jesus that he was a teacher who has come from God, for no one could perform the signs you were doing if God were not with him. And I find it interesting in that passage from John that we just read that John says that Joseph was a secret believer, but it doesn't really say whether Nicodemus was a believer. A lot of people will, and I think it's a natural conclusion to come to, will conclude that he was a believer. But the Bible doesn't say anywhere that he was a believer. Personally, I believe he was at least a skeptic, right? He was at least somebody that thought Jesus could be the Messiah. And that's why he went and visited him, I believe, in John chapter 3 and had that conversation with him, was to learn about him and from him. But pieces of this story feel a little bit different if you think of Nicodemus as a believer, or if you think of Nicodemus maybe as a skeptic, or, I think there's some small chance that maybe he even thought Jesus was a fraud. And the way that the story unfolds, in my mind anyway, just feels a little bit different depending on how we think of Nicodemus. And the one thing Oh, sorry. I'm not used to clicking the thing. Dan's laughing at me. All right. One thing that I know about who they were, or that I believe, is that they were the answer to Pilate's dilemma about what he was going to do with the body of Jesus. If you think about it, that's not necessarily an easy answer at the time that Pilate is making a decision to crucify him. There's all kinds of uproar about Jesus. Who knows what his disciples are going to do? Who knows how the people are going to react? What is he going to do with that body? And it's inevitable, something's going to need to be done with it. And when you think about it too, when Jesus was crucified and before and after, there were a whole bunch of troubling signs. Pilate had to be thinking a little bit about, what have I done? Right? He got the note from his wife that said, don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him. And then that's followed up by 3 hours of darkness, the curtain of the temple being torn in two. Matthew tells us that holy people were raised from the dead, that there was an earthquake. There was even a centurion that said, surely this must be the Son of God, just because of the signs that were going on. And so now Pilate, with all this in his mind, has to decide what he's going to do with the body of Jesus. And it must have felt a little bit like a stroke of good fortune that, here comes Joseph, known as a good man, a member of the Sanhedrin. I mean, they were the ones that sentenced him to death. But he's not coming necessarily as him and the whole Sanhedrin. He's coming as an individual and saying, hey, can I have the body of Jesus? And so from Pilate's perspective, this was probably an easy way out and maybe a good choice. But from this point on, this is where Joseph and Nicodemus are going to experience the physical reality of the death of Jesus like nobody else in human history. First, it tells us in Luke that they took the body down, wrapped it in linen, and placed it in a tomb cut in the rock. And what was that like to take the body down? The cross itself was a heavy wooden cross, and it was propped up. Maybe it was in a hole or something like that. They would have to lift it up in order to lay it down. I can't believe that they would try to remove the body of Jesus while the cross was still in the air. They would have to lay it down on the ground. That has to be a two-man job at least. And then how do they remove the nails? That seems like that would be a brute force thing they would have to do. And so that whole experience had to be very physical. And to sidetrack a little bit, when you think about it, they're seeing the body of Jesus, and he's clearly dead. But the nails weren't what held him on the cross. And the wounds they could see, that wasn't what killed him, right? My sin, our sin, held him on the cross. And he voluntarily stayed there and died so that he could pay the debt for our sin. So that contrast maybe between what they could see physically and that the most important parts of the story really weren't physical. They weren't the things that those two guys could see is interesting to me. And after they took him down, they washed the body, and they wrapped him in linen with 75 pounds of spices. How long would that take to wrap that body in 75 pounds of spices? It seems like, and they knew, by the way, these guys clearly would know the Jewish burial customs, and they would want to do it right. And so they would follow whatever the proper procedure was. And the part of this story that I just can't get out of my head is, what would they talk about while they were doing that? The Bible doesn't tell us, and it would be pure speculation to guess at what it was. And maybe they worked in silence. Maybe they didn't say a word. But if I was standing there, if I was doing that, I would have said something. And again, this is where, if Nicodemus is a skeptic or a believer or maybe even an unbeliever, the story feels a little bit different, right? I mean, what would he say if he was an unbeliever? If he thought Jesus was a fraud, what would he say to Joseph, who was standing right there with him? And maybe he didn't even know that Joseph was a believer. He was a secret believer. Would he have said something like, man, I'm glad he finally got what he deserved? What would that experience be like? How would I feel if I was in that room? Now, I personally believe that he was at least a skeptic, Nicodemus, if not a believer. And so the conversation between two believers, with Jesus, obviously dead. I mean, I would have said something like, I thought he was the Messiah. I thought he was the one. And could I be wrong about that? And I would have thought, well, he performed all those miracles. And even Nicodemus, standing right there, was the one that said that he could only do that if God was with him. He drove out demons. He healed the sick. He fed 5,000. He even raised Lazarus from the dead. He can't be just nobody. He's got to be somebody. And he taught with amazing insight. Again, Nicodemus met with him in John chapter 3 and had that conversation and learned a little bit from him. And he's supposed to be a carpenter? How could that be? It seems to me that his death, it could absolutely shake the faith of a believer. And what would Nicodemus the skeptic, if he was, what would it be like for him to go through that process? This is absolutely, in my opinion, the lowest point in the crucifixion story, and really the lowest point in human history. We couldn't do anything worse than we did right here. Hope for mankind at this point is like a flickering candle. It's about to be extinguished. It would be so hard to remain faithful through that. But then, could he really come back? This clicker is going to be the death of me. Could he really come back? They probably heard about him teaching. Again, it's in all four Gospels. He taught that he was going to have to die and come back. The disciples heard that, and maybe they heard it. You have to believe that they knew that Jesus had told the chief priests that he would rise again in 3 days. And the Pharisees, Nicodemus being a Pharisee, you'd think he would know that. And they didn't believe it, of course. They asked Pilate to guard the tomb so that the disciples couldn't steal the body, right? They didn't believe he was going to come back. But if they had heard that he had said those things, Jesus did what he said he would do over and over and over again. He did what he said he would do. He said he was coming back. And Jesus demonstrated power over death in raising Lazarus. How would that have affected those two men as they stood there and talked about it? Do you think he's going to come back? He doesn't look like he's going to come back. But do you think he's going to come back? And it would be, it's right there. It's vivid and in their face that Jesus is dead at that point. How hard would it be to believe that he's going to come back? But then, after the resurrection, what would that be like when he has come back? And of course, at first, the apostles didn't even believe he had come back, right? That's how hard it is to believe. And Thomas, think about Thomas. He wasn't going to believe until he could put his fingers in the wounds of the body. Yet, clearly, he had come back. He had fulfilled that promise that he had made. He clearly had power over death. And hope for mankind may have been flickering and going out, but man, it burst into flame when Jesus came back. He provided us hope in that payment that he made for our sins, that we could be forgiven and look forward to an eternity in heaven. That's incredible hope for mankind. And it's helpful for me to think about that contrast from that lowest point in human history, that lowest point in the crucifixion story, to what that must have been like afterward when he came back. The joy they must have felt, and the promise they must have felt based on seeing that Jesus actually did come back from the dead. Now let's think on these things and focus our minds as we partake of the Lord's Supper.